Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We will begin the book launch shortly. We request you to please settle down and switch off your mobile phones or turn them to silent mode. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and members of the press. On behalf of India Habitat Center, I extend a very warm welcome to each one of you on the launch of this important book that tells a side of Indian history long ignored, a story waiting to be told. The Indentured and Their Route, a relentless quest for identity by Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, multifaceted and multi-talented personality, writer, commentator, diplomat, and President, India Habitat Center. We are honored to have with us the chief guest of the evening, Shri Hardeep Singh Puri, Honorable Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas and of Housing and Urban Affairs. We are also pleased to have with us Ambassador Rajiv Dogra, commentator and a fellow Rupa author. He will be in conversation with Ambassador Mukherjee this evening. To begin today's program, may I invite Shri Kapish Mehra, Managing Director, Rupa Publications India, to share with us the journey of this book and deliver the publisher's address, please.
Thank you, Kanika. First of all, a very good evening to the Honorable Chief Guest of the evening, Shri Hardeep Puri ji, the most important person in the room, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, distinguished friends, ladies and gentlemen. Today is a rare honor for us. As publishers, book launches are something that we are used to doing by the script, one practically every other week. But every book launch is different, and every difference is for a certain reason. Today's book launch is special for a very important reason, because publishing houses are made by their authors. Our identity is that of the identity of the author. And it makes me feel proud that the first row today in this auditorium is packed with all of our authors, or some of our authors, and all of them are authors. So thank you very much for giving us this privilege. It is rare that we get opportunities to publish books on subjects that may not have been captured in mainstream writing as much as it should have. And when this proposal came to us and when this discussion happened, we were of the opinion that something like this needs to be put out, only because it is easy to ignore but difficult to forget. So I think this is a very good subject that Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee has picked up, and I'm glad that she's worked hard at it. Because like they say, Aloo and Indians are there everywhere across the globe, but we sometimes don't get to the story why that is. And I'm glad, ma'am, that you found the time to actually discover that in greater detail. And ladies and gentlemen, because we are heading into Christmas and this is a holiday time, etc., just to sort of, say that my job here as a publisher is to just essentially do three things for you. Talk highly about the book, which I have, talk highly about the author, which I'm continuing to do, and ask all of you to buy a copy of the book, which I will remind you. With these words, I just want to congratulate the author once again. It is indeed a wonderful opportunity for us to have had the privilege to publish this book. And as I said, life is just a reflection of what you see in front of you. And when you see your author sitting in front of you, I think the reflection is wonderful. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Shri Mehra, for bringing this historically important book before the public. Ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Minister Shri Hardeep Singh Puri has written the foreword to this book by Ambassador Mukherjee. May I request the Honorable Minister to come onto the stage and share his thoughts on the book.
Thank you very much. The head of the publishing house just shared with us the duties that the publisher has to perform whenever a book is launched. He has to say good things about the book, good things about the author, and then request everyone to buy a copy. I'm going to use that as a starting point this evening. I have done my homework, and I can say without fear of contradiction that in this distinguished gathering of authors and book lovers, I have known Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee longer than anyone else. I say that because when I say some things about her many qualities, I have seen those evolve. From the time that she was a student activist at Miranda House in Delhi University, and I see Kirti sitting here, so she will testify to that. She was able to combine student activism, solid academic credentials, and many other things to evolve both from a student into a teacher, a serious student of history, and then on to a very successful career in the Foreign Service. And most of us, when we reach the point of superannuation, we start wondering how to occupy ourselves. Even there, she has been extremely active, and I must compliment her for several qualities, and I'll come to them in a minute. But today, I think I want to focus on her as a student of history. But before I go on to talk about the book, and I know as the one who's performing essentially a ceremonial role rather than a substantive role, which Rajiv, my friend and batchmate, will do in conversation with the author, I want to recall a few incidents. There was a time, I think there was a gathering in St. Stephen's College when I was on the teaching faculty, and there was a prominent left-wing intellectual who had been invited to speak, and I was perhaps more irreverent then than I am even today. The gentleman's name, I don't know whether you want me to share with you. This was the time of the Third International, and the gentleman's name was Tariq Ali. I found him intellectually stimulating, but I found a little streak of the humbug in him. So I got up, and I don't know, without any provocation, and I said, I suppose espousal of this kind of ideology with residence abroad and a British passport helps. Now, I think he took it quite well and he was ready to answer. But then there were some student leaders or activists. One of them had the name of a cat, and they all wanted to pounce on us. So one very close friend of mine, Suhas Chakravarti, who was then a senior member of the teaching faculty in St. Stephen's College, Bhaswati Mukherjee, and me, we had to be provided shelter by Homai's father, Professor Kapadia. Now, I've seen the author evolve, and it's that maturity of being able to deal with an historical event and to provide an interpretation on it, which I found fascinating. Let me share with you what I said when I was invited to her last book's release function. I had then quoted the British historian John H. Arnold to describe Bhaswati's view, and I repeat it here again, and there's something I found in the book itself. I'll just cross-reference that. And I quote, "The past itself is not a narrative in its entirety. It is chaotic, uncoordinated, and complex as life. History is about making sense of that mess, finding or creating patterns and meanings and stories from that maelstrom." And today, when I was again leafing through this book, I found something on the inner flap. It said, "It is the search for identity of the indentured that offers a possible response to the dialectics of coolitude versus nationalism. It does not involve the rewriting of history, but its reinterpretation." I think that's reinterpretation of history is what this is all about. I've read this book. I was a little apprehensive I might not be here this evening because all of us have political duties that outnumber the number of days in a week. So, but I'm very happy that that event did not require out of Delhi travel. I think when Bhaswati and I were students in the university, that is a time in the 70s. I think that is a time when historiography and more than that, the understanding of historical writing was beginning to take shape. Now, I think the most obvious conclusion that one reaches is that with so many Indian diaspora around, I have saying 1.3 million Indian laborers who were inveigled into servitude across the Kala Pani as per the so-called great experiment of the British after it abolished slavery. Now, I think that's the starting point. You abolish slavery in, where, 1833, and then you still after that take out 1.3 million Indians in different garb as coolies, etc., across Kala Pani, etc. Now, the book lists, and I've taken out some extracts. I'm not going to go over all of them. I'll just cross-reference them. The Apravasi Ghat, built by the British government in 1834 for the Great Experiment in Mauritius. In Mauritius, Hindus comprise 52% of the total population, and a majority speak Bhojpuri and understand Hindi, which is recognized as the ancestral language of Hindus in Mauritius and a symbol of Hindu identity. The annual pilgrimage of Grand Basin, a mountain lake in the southwest of Mauritius known to Hindus as Ganga Talao, on the occasion of Shivratri. Steady flow of Indians to Fiji from 1879 to 1916. The majority of them, I think about 80% of them came from Uttar Pradesh. Another 13% came from Bihar and Bengal. There was also a tiny Muslim minority of around 6,787. Hindi Bhojpuri is the main written and spoken language among Fiji Indians. Two racist groups in 1987-2000 seeking to disempower Fijian citizens of Indian origin resulted in the mass exodus of more than 100,000 Indians, mainly to Australia. Very few, surprisingly, chose to return to India. Now, countries like Fiji, Mauritius, Suriname, and Guyana have many lawmakers of Indian origin. And that interactive process, when I was a student in Delhi University, we had a very large contingent of students from these countries. They came here, they went back. Many of them occupied positions of influence and prominence in their own countries. Some rose to be heads of state and government. Guyana has seen 2 prime ministers and 3 presidents of Indian origin. The political history of Mauritius is dominated by Indian origin politicians, 4 prime ministers, 6 presidents, and 2 of the 3 founding fathers. Now, when I started leafing through the book, I came across several passages which I found to be exceptionally powerful, both in the poetry and in what was being said. I'm not going to read those because I think, as usual, I would then go on longer than I expect to or wanted to. But there's one passage which I was very moved by. It said that when we moved from where we were born, we lost our earth and everything. Now, where we are, if we lose our identity, then you wonder what this whole life is all about. And I think, therefore, this focus on the relentless quest for identity that Ambassador Mukherjee captures in this book, it's a story that has been around. It's not that you are doing new research. Much of the literature of that period and the subsequent period and how these Indian origin communities survived, their inner resilience, their challenges that they faced, and the success they made of their lives. That is one story. But to place in good historical perspective that relentless quest for identity, I think that's what all this book is all about. And I want you all to join me in giving her a very warm round of well-deserved applause. The book is extremely well written. I did take the liberty of pointing out a little typo. I am described not as a minister but as a ministry. Now that's extremely flattering, but that's really not true. But let me come back to the author, both in terms of the book on Bengal and its partition, and this book, and whatever else I've seen written by her on the European Union, etc. I think the fact that an author can combine good academic rigor with the analysis and treatment of a subject that is partly in history, but whose political significance I think lies now, because that quest for identity and how this is shaping, and particularly I think at a time like the one we are in today. Because today you will find that many of these communities in countries as far-flung as Fiji to Guyana, Reunion Islands, wherever, you find them assuming positions. They are reimagining their own identities, and I think the umbilical link with the country of origin or the motherland, I think that is a story. And I think I don't want to sound cynical, but this is a very important book, but I think it also deserves to be part of a larger project. The larger project, I think, can go into the granular understanding of how these communities, there are identities and there are similarities and there are dissimilarities. A friend of mine in the UK who once used to be known as the beer man, but he's now a very famous chancellor of a university and a lord of the upper House of Lords. He is even must be my age or a little younger. He says he's going back to Cambridge to do an analysis of the treatment of minorities and minorities globally. So he came to me because he's a Parsi, and he said, what happened to the Sikhs, etc. I think that kind of a project, which is an overall project, and this, so I'm just giving Ambassador Mukherjee some ideas. You know, she's doesn't have enough time, doesn't have enough work as president of the India Habitat Center, then she doesn't have enough work, Pankaj, I must tell you that, as being on the board of Petronet. So I think she's got a lot of spare time. So if you use the active mind to work on a larger project, I think you'll be doing a great service, as which this book already is. I just want to conclude, my friend, the publisher, also said that it's good to say things about the book, the author, and then tell them to buy it. I have a slightly nuanced position on that. I said, I think good wine needs no bush, and therefore both the author and the book will sell on their own. All you have to do as a publisher is to ensure that the narrative of this book and its significance is captured both through reviews and the kind of minimal marketing that is required. After that, a good book always takes work. So once again, heartiest congratulations, Ambassador Mukherjee. And knowing her has been an education. We've not always agreed. There was a time when one of my successors in London and I walked into a room when she was JS Europe West, and she told both of us that she was too busy to see us. Obviously, I mean, I don't need to, I asked Lakshmi before I came up, how much of that kind of talk am I allowed? She said, none whatsoever. So, in the fulsome praise that I offer you, Madam Author, Madam President of IHC, member of your board, etc., amidst all that deep respect, I think she also has a lot of courage, conviction, ideological conviction, and I've seen that conviction, transform and this thing. So it's a great, the friendship is very old. I also think that even at this stage, I think you have many more books to come, and you have much more contribution. And I'll end with one very disappointing thing. I have tried to encourage her. Instead of being in Delhi, she should have been in West Bengal to take over the political leadership there, because I see remarkable similarities. Thank you very much. Can I come down?
Thank you, sir, for your words of appreciation and encouragement. May I request you to please remain on stage to formally release the book, The Indentured and Their Route, A Relentless Quest for Identity. I would also like to request the author, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, Ambassador Dogra, and Mr. Mehra to join in.
Sorry. Speaking very well.
Thank you all, distinguished guests. Multi-talented Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee has distinguished herself as a successful diplomat, powerful speaker on public affairs, acclaimed writer, and on the boards of major India corporations. She is the president of the India Habitat Center. Her major passion in life continues to be India and the world. Of Bengal by birth, heart, and conviction, her book Bengal and Its Partition is considered a fundamental read. The Indentured and Their Route is a label of love dedicated to India's lost children. To hear all about the tales and the toil behind this deeply researched and path-breaking book, I would like to request the author to share a few words.
Thank you very much, Kanika. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister for Urban Development, all my friends, the publisher, Kapish, and so many others here I can see, including Mr. Amitav Kant and Secretary Petroleum and so many others. Thank you all for coming, and all my friends from the Foreign Service. It's difficult to introduce a book which is a work of passion, because for me, it was a work of passion. I thought it needed to be written. And when did I decide to write this book? Minister Puri talked about Apravasi Ghat. So I'll begin with Apravasi Ghat and say that when I was India's ambassador to UNESCO in 2007, I was India's member on the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, and we were at Lithuania to discuss the inscription of Apravasi Ghat on UNESCO's World Heritage Site. And the representative of ICOMOS, a British woman whom I took an intense dislike to immediately, it was like at first sight, if you know what I mean. I remember her name was Susan. She said that Apravasi Ghat was basically an immigration depot to offer miserable and impoverished Indians who knew no better, a better life, to get away from the misery that was India, and therefore there was no question of inscribing it on the World Heritage Site of UNESCO. At that point, the Minister of Culture of Mauritius, who has praised the book, Mukesh Chuni, turned around to me and he said, "Madam Ambassador, can you describe indenture, since we Africans are better at describing the horrors of slavery rather than the horrors of indenture?" And I looked at him and I thought, 1.5 million Indians have been forgotten in India and across the world. And today, sitting in Vilnius, without any preparation, I have to explain why Apravasi Ghat needs to be remembered as a historical event, like nothing else before it and nothing else after it. So I spoke for 15 minutes extempore. I explained about how these desperate people, impoverished and driven out of their lands after the permanent settlement, forced to grow opium and sell it without profit, not allowed to grow food, driven out of their lands, at the mercy of the zamindar and the British colonialist, were then inveigled by people called Arkatias, the recruiters. I call them compradors. The minister would say that shows my Marxist heritage, somebody said. Well, I don't know about that. Compradors is what I would call them, the Arkatias. And they were fooled into taking the ship across the Kalapani by being told that they were taken to a small island called Tapas, which is half an hour from Kolkata harbor. Instead, they were put into the same slave ships but without chains, put their thumb marks on a piece of paper they did not understand called the Girmit, never to know that, like in Gore Island, where in Senegal, the proud black African would forever become a slave, the proud Indian would never see his motherland or her motherland ever again. But more than that, would be forgotten by the motherland until somebody decided to remind the motherland that these are India's lost children. And that is when the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO, for the first time in its history, said that they would inscribe Apravasi Ghat on the World Heritage List of UNESCO without debate and by acclamation. And for me, in my Foreign Service career, there was no better moment than that moment. I began my book by quoting Vivekanand because I thought that it's important to understand that India has never been a colonial power, but we have been at the mercy of colonizers. And Vivekanand had said, India for thousands of years peacefully existed. We of all nations of the world have never been a conquering race, and that blessing is on our head, and therefore we live. But then, these lost children of India were able to survive and were able to build rainbow nations only because of their relentless desire to cling to that identity. And in my book, I have explained that what is identity. And I have explained that in this particular case, identity was a mechanism to hold on to a most unpleasant present by recalling the past with its language, poetry, music, and religion, and to hope for a better future. And if you look at the Bhojpuri songs that were sung by the Jahaj Bhais and Jahaj Behns, where they built that bond which would never break, you would then understand what an Indian identity means to a lost Indian, to an Indian who, for instance, in Reunion Island, was being totally déraciné. His roots were being destroyed. He was not allowed to remember the name of his village, not allowed to remember his name, his language, not allowed to speak the language even at home. These are people who still clung on to their identity. I've also written in my book that this quest for identity continues. When it is denied, it results in conflict and war. When it is not denied, because they did not allow it to be denied, it flourishes into the great Indian diaspora that we are so proud of. And that's why we need to know more about the background of such people. I have also explained about the dialectical relationship, and again, dialectics is very Marxist, I must agree. The dialectical relationship between slavery and indenture. There are two sides of the same colonial coin. On one side, the black slave, on the other, the brown indentured. But then, the colonizer played the biggest trick of all, that exactly like the poisoned grapes of communalism that set brother against brother, sister against sister, family against family, pre-partition, in different parts of the plantation colonies, they set the blacks against the indenture. This was particularly true in Fiji, where there was a form of apartheid practiced, where the blacks and the Indians were never allowed to socialize, were never allowed to intermarry, were never allowed to know anything about each other, and were taught by the colonizer to despise each other. The colonizers told the Indians that the blacks are junglis, jungali, and they told the blacks, these are feeble, meek people, not even good for hard labor, but we have no option because you've been freed, we had to get them. They taught them to mutually despise each other. And that is precisely why, in many parts of the former sugar plantations, but particularly in Fiji, such unfortunate events happened that so many 100,000 Indians ultimately left Fiji and made their homes elsewhere, mainly in Australia, I must acknowledge, and a few, very few, in New Zealand, but they did not come back to India. A large part of my book is also focused on the indentured woman. And many have told me that I should write a separate book on indentured woman. I don't know if Kapish will agree or not. I began the chapter on indentured woman by quoting what Amitabh Bachchan said in Pink when he said, "तू खुद की खोज में निकल, तू किस लिए हताश है, तू चल तेरी वजूद की, समय को भी तलाश है. Go and find your moment. This is your moment in time. Don't be afraid. Reach out for it." And why did I write that? I write it because these poor indentured women were the worst victims. They were portrayed as immoral, as prostitutes, as without roots, And the worst part of it is that they were particularly harsh on the indentured Hindu woman, saying that they came from the brothels of Calcutta, that they had no mores, and that they were the ones who were responsible for social unrest wherever the indentured were. Why did this happen? It happened because these women were never in the discourse. They were never consulted. Their voices were silent. And their voices remained silent for a very long time. But if you look at the course of history of the sugar plantations, you would see, as I've written in my book, that the quest for identity also succeeded because the indentured woman did not let go. Even if the indentured man let go, the woman did not let go. The woman built the family. The woman kept the family together. The woman ensured that culture and religion would be preserved. I don't want to stand between Ambassador Dogra, who's going to be in conversation with me, but I wanted to say that this book was also written because there was this perception that Indians were meek and servile, and therefore they were colonized. Even Gandhiji asked this question, that how come 4,000 British civil servants, assisted by 60,000 soldiers and 90,000 civilians, billeted themselves upon a country of 300 million persons? The answer is very simple. The colonizer made us lose self-respect, forget our identity, look down upon us. As Joseph Conrad in Heart of Darkness noted, and I've said in my book, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only. And what is the idea? The idea is their search for resources, territory, and subordinate people. And how do you subordinate these people? By controlling their narratives, by making them feel that they come from an inferior culture, who are born to be servile and to be ruled. But this did not work, because in the sugar plantations, in all the plantation colonies, the Indian indenture very quickly understood that they have to struggle for political power. And in this struggle for political power, they were able to build new rainbow nations. And one very good example has been given of Mauritius and Ganga Talao that I have been to, which on Shivratri day that I have been there and seen, it comes alive in such a way that you don't think you're in Mauritius, you think you're in India. And that is one of the most moving experiences of any Indian who goes to Mauritius on Shivratri and goes to Ganga Talao. I'd like to also say that in Mauritius, there are 2 World Heritage Sites, because Mauritius has a troubled history of both slavery and indentured. Apravasi Ghat is the World Heritage Site for the indentured. And close to it, high up on the cliffs, is another World Heritage Site called La Morne. And La Morne is the place where these slaves, usually from Madagascar, would climb on the top and would jump into the ocean to certain death, but always in the direction of Madagascar, because they wanted their souls to go back to Madagascar. That site, like Apravasi Ghat, is full of brooding voices, unheard voices, feet that have walked there. And you go either to Apravasi Ghat, you go to where the people with cholera were quarantined with people who are not sick, so that they all fell sick together. You go to the places where those with cholera but still alive were thrown off the ships. And that's when you understand what it meant, the horrors of colonialism. I would conclude by just mentioning one incident which deeply moved me, which was that when I was in Mauritius and I met Mukesh Chuni, the culture minister, he asked me, have you ever met in India any family called Chuni? I said, no, never heard of such a name. He said, well, my great-grandparents were put into these indentured ships, and they both contracted cholera, and while they were still alive, they were thrown overboard. And they had a small child who was brought up by the other indentured, and in Bhojpuri, the child was called Chunni Munni. When they reached Mauritius, Apravasi Ghat, and they got off, the white overseer asked, what is the name of this child? The indentured, who spoke no French or no English, just said, Chunni Munni. So, the name became Chunni, and 3 generations later, Mukesh Chunni became the culture minister of Mauritius, the ambassador of High Commissioner of Mauritius to India, and is today the proud president of Gopio International. So, I conclude by saying that the Bhagavad Gita provides us the final response to the traveler in the long journey to discover the lost identity after this exile from Mother India. It says, I am what is, and I am what is not. Identity comes from both what you are and what you are not. And this is what the indenture needs to discover. Only then, in my perspective, will their relentless quest to search and find their identity find fruition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for those impassioned, deeply moving, and inspiring words. May I request Ambassador Dogra to come on stage and take the evening with the author forward.
Foreign service people like to drink, but this is only cough syrup. So I've just recovered from bronchitis.
Cough syrup or vodka?
Cough syrup.
So, Madam, can I call you Bhaswati?
You can call me my pet name.
Okay. Now, after the eloquence of Honorable Minister, your own, is there anything left to say?
Yes.
I'll try.
You are the lost for words.
This is not the only conversation I have with Bhaswati. In fact, we have a lot of conversations. Most of the time, she is in the talking mode, I am in the listening mode. So hopefully today I'll be able to get a few words edgeways. But there's a lot to be said about indenture, about our callousness as a society, that while there were books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, Roots, about the slaves and the ordeal or the torture and the anguish they went through, but there's nothing that has been written till you took up the pen about what happened to the indentured. Where did they go? How were they pushed out of India? Now, you told us about your experience with Susan, which sort of triggered the first desire to write something. But was that the only occasion? Because it took you some time, finally, to start writing this book. What really was your eureka moment when you came back to India, spent a couple of years before starting to write the book? Or was that single incident always bothering you that you must tell the story?
Thank you, Rajiv. That's a very important question. Actually, the Eureka moment, as you put it, was in 2007. But when I came back to India, and as the minister said, in my heart, actually, I am very, very Bengali. Although I was born and brought up in Delhi, and I speak English and French better than Bengali. But I always wanted to write about the Bengal partition because it bothered me that especially in North India, everybody knows about the Punjab partition, but nobody knows what a tragedy was the Bengal partition. Once I had finished writing the Bengal partition, I understood that the poisoned grapes of communalism, which resulted in the great tragedy in Bengal, first in 1905 and then in 1947, took a different shape and form of poisoned grapes in Fiji, in Reunion, in Mauritius, and that it was my duty and responsibility as the person responsible for the inscription of Apravasi Ghat to explain, particularly to my fellow Indians, that India's lost children deserve to be remembered, deserve to be mourned, deserve to be honored for what they did to preserve India's culture and identity abroad. That's why I wrote the book.
You said you are a proud Bengali, and you should be. In fact, Bengal, as the minister said, should be proud of you. But you also write in your book that the Bhadralok, during the height of this indentured period, said indenture was a good thing. How can you be proud of Bengal then?
Because I'm not a Bhadralok. I have criticized the Bhadralok in the Bengal partition book also. The Bhadralok and the Zamindar had a very poor understanding of the national movement in the beginning.
So if you're not a Bhadralok, then you are the right candidate to go back to Bengal.
But that's not the subject matter of our discussion today, Rajiv.
Anyway, to come back to the subject, as you command, the three books you've written, Europe, Bengal, and now Indenture, is there a design to their coming to birth, or a thread that links them together, or it's just that you felt at that particular moment you had to write something about Europe because you dealt with it for so long, you had to write about Bengal because, as you said, Bengal's partition, its pain had not been written about. And now, of course, indentures. So what was it? A link, a thread, or not linked at all?
No, it was completely linked, Rajiv. You're very right. The common thread was, I am the longest standing Joint Secretary Europe West in MEA. I've beaten Tibu Daulat Singh's record, I'm told. And I realized that the story of Europe and India needed to be narrated from a European perspective and an Indian perspective, because it's a very complex and complicated relationship. So when I wrote my book on EU and India, I tried to present the perspective of Europe and the perspective of India, and to see whether the two perspectives can be reconciled, while explaining to the Europeans that colonized people have a very thin skin and don't like to be lectured in public, don't like to be hectored, don't like to be asked, why are you doing this, why are you doing that? But if there is some diplomacy in the back, there can be a meeting of minds. And I also examined whether the strategic partnership between Europe and India could ever work. Then I went to the partition book, which I explained, and this one. And now I'm very, very tempted, actually, as Minister Puri said, to maybe link it to another project, a bigger project, and also to write a full book on the indentured women, because nobody has ever thought about the final victim, that is the indentured woman, and the kind of pain and suffering that they were subjected to, also because of conservative Victorian morality and Indian social conservatism, let's face it, of the time. So that's a common thread between the books.
You talked about suffering just a second back. Both your books, The Partition of Bengal and Indentured, are essentially against your nature. You are a cheerful person, and these two books were about loss and pain. So, did it have a psychological effect on you while you were writing them?
No, I think I felt more cheerful after writing it, Rajiv, because I felt cheerful that I had educated hordes of my countrymen and countrywomen about the fact that, as Hegel said, unless you know your own history, history can repeat itself. I don't want history to repeat itself, so I want my countrymen and countrywomen to understand the tragedy of our past so that we can build a better future. So actually it makes me feel more cheerful.
History, they say, is often an embroidered version of what actually happened. So did you embroider it at some stage in your books?
I didn't have to, Rajiv. In fact, I toned it down because some of the accounts were so horrific that I thought Rupa may not pass it. And, publishers are very powerful people. I didn't want them to say that this book is like a horror story and we can't publish it. So I actually didn't embroider anything at all. I could have written a more horrific narration of the kind of treatment, for instance, as I have written in my book, Cholera and Quarantine, the treatment of people who were thrown overboard while they were alive, the deliberate decision to fill the ship's water with cholera-contaminated Hooghly water, knowing that this is going to cause cholera, and making sure that the white cabin crew did not drink the same water. So these were things I didn't elaborate upon because I thought that it was too depressing to write about. So I actually didn't embroider anything at all.
Most of the departures were from Calcutta.
Yes,
Kolkata. Were there many Bengalis who became the part of that indentured journey? Where did this recruitment come from?
The recruitment came from areas of severe agrarian distress all over the eastern part of India and eastern UP. So, as a result of the permanent settlement, many small farmers became landless. Bengal went through a series of famines. Each time there was a famine, the Brits would increase the tribute. And then there would be these bands of desperate people who would reach Kolkata, and then they would be lured into these ships. Very similar to my Bengal partition book, where I explained about the great Kolkata famine, and I explained it was a man-made famine because in a year of full harvest, the harvest was taken away so that the Burmese, who had been invaded, the Japanese don't use those crops. So similarly, in this particular instance, initially the Bengalis who went on those boats were those who were landless and who were in severe distress. Later on, more Bengalis joined. But I would say that the greater number of people who went on those boats were from Bihar, what is called United Provinces, and Bihar. They were the majority of the people who were in the greatest agrarian distress, who were lured into these boats from Kolkata.
Well, 85%, you write in your book, 85% of the indentured came from India. Yeah. Why not from China?
That's a very interesting story I've written in my book. That in Mauritius, the Brits initially tried to recruit some Chinese. And what they wrote was that these are very lazy, opium-addicted people who ask too many questions. And on the other hand, you had this bunch of impoverished Indians who were brought to Mauritius to cultivate sugar plantations that they did not know anything about because they had never cultivated sugar plantations in their life. And they were initially too scared to protest. So they just completely stopped recruiting Chinese and they just focused on recruiting Indians. As the agrarian distress in India increased, the pressure to recruit more and more Indians also increased. And that's how, at one point, you could say 1.5 million Indians were taken away from their motherland, and most of them never returned.
And often in the ships that had earlier taken slaves. The conventional wisdom says that when slavery was abolished, it wasn't abolished all of a sudden, it took about 30 years. When slavery was abolished, then they sort of came to India, took the indentured route. But is that really the entire story? Because I have a feeling that the slaves, the blacks or whatever you call them, unfortunately, were too aggressive. At times, they also killed the captains of some of the ships. At times, they revolted and took over the ship itself. And when they landed there, again, there were stories of some aggression against the colonizers. So, was it a combination of these two, that slavery was abolished over a period of time and the colonizers got tired of these unruly fellows, so they thought the docile Indians would be better suited to do the work unquestionably?
No, Rajiv. The slaves were kept in chains, in conditions of inhuman bondage that I didn't ever want to write about. What happened was that because of pressure from the Anti-Slavery League, slavery was finally abolished and the sugar plantations fell silent. That is when the devious colonial mind of our colonizers decided that you have all these impoverished Indians who have been driven into starvation. They're not allowed to grow food crops even for themselves. They were forbidden to grow food crops in their own little holdings. And that is when this devious colonial plot developed of taking them there. And that is why I described that slavery and indenture are two parts of the same colonial coin. One is the black man and the other is the brown Indian. That is why I also explained about the politics of Kalapani, coolitude and negritude. And in my second last chapter, I explained what is negritude, I explained what is coolitude, I explained the politics of Kalapani, and I explained exactly the Kalapani narrative in the development of the national movement. Because it was actually the Kalapani narrative, the way it was played out, which also led to the resurgence of nationalism and the understanding finally, reluctantly by the colonizers, that it's not possible to hold on anymore to these colonial possessions.
Was it really nationalism? Because that didn't come about till Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya told Gandhiji to go and visit Mauritius, I think. Or was it that they did not need any more indentured or slaves because whatever had to be cultivated from swamps had become a cultivatable land? And the second thing is, the First World War was about to begin. So, rather than concentrate on the war effort, getting indentured by ships would have been a tremendous waste of their energy and time.
So let me put the facts for you in a historical context, Rajiv, because you're not a historian, you're an engineer, right? So,
engineered historian.
Engineered historian. So let me put the dates for you correctly so that you understand the perspective. The perspective is that slavery was abolished, indenture took its place, and the slaves were freed, and they tried to make them work on very low wages, which they refused. Many of them went back to their homeland. They also tried to bring in some white labor. But that did not work because the white labor spent most of the time in Mauritius drinking rum and sitting and enjoying himself. They refused to work. So you had to have the indenture. When Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya wrote to Gandhiji, Gandhiji first sent another person who's very, very famous, and he spent a couple of years in Mauritius, and Gandhiji on his final route back stopped over in Mauritius, and he spent a week there. Bubonic plague had broken out at Mauritius, so he couldn't go around much, but he continued. And Manilal Doctor, whom he had sent earlier, then played a very important role in Mauritius, and then went to Fiji, Manilal Doctor, and they were responsible as trained barristers to make the indentured understand what their rights were. After that, you had the German U-boats bringing down the indentured ships. You had the miserable defeat of the British in Mesopotamia. You had the resignation of the then Viceroy. You had the British decision to stop indenture in 1917 and to send them into the British Indian Army, so that with the same British Indian Army they would win World War I. They promised Gandhiji that they would give us autonomy. Instead, they rewarded us with Jallianwala Bagh. And then, after that, since indenture was abolished, they had to come to some political arrangement, and that's when the indentured started fighting for their rights. So that is the actual historical narrative, Rajiv, of the facts.
Bhaswati, I think we are running out of time. So one question and one comment. You know, especially in Caribbean, the blacks are known for the calypso music. And that's a sort of a lament for the life they had left behind and the life they were forced to lead, and also against their colonial masters. But that's about it, because they didn't carry any unified religion along with them, nor did they come from a single entity as a nation. Whereas Indians had carried their religion, they had carried their tradition, their culture, their food habits, their clothing pattern. It still remains the same, as if time has stood still. So, which sustained life better generation after generation? The Indian indenture or the slaves? Whether calypso was enough for them, whether their aggression was enough for them, or the docile Indian who stuck to his past.
Well, you know, Rajiv, for a historical engineer or engineer who knows history, you ask very tricky questions. And I'll answer it, because it's a very interesting question. Yeah, absolutely. So the calypso was a lament. The calypso actually is a lament against ingrained racism in these areas. The calypso looks into the black man's past and mourns the loss of his identity. On the contrary, as far as the Indians are concerned, if you look at the Bhojpuri songs which they sing, or the poetry that they have written, and the poetry that has been written later, for instance by Khar Torabuli, it's a very famous Indo-Mauritian poet, they have written about the fact, A, that they did not lose their identity, but how much they were tortured to keep that identity. And this is particularly true in Reunion Island. If you go to Reunion Island, where these people have been totally déracinés, as we say in French, and there it's called the Route des Engagés, you would find that despite the fact that they don't know which village they come from, they only speak French, but they use curry patta, they use Indian food, they have little Lakshmis in their bedroom, etc. And that is so touching to think that you were not able to destroy and empty out their mind completely. Despite being the Raciné, they are still Raciné. And that, I think, is a great tribute to Indian culture and civilization.
So, what you're saying basically is that the roots about indenture has yet to be written.
Move the mic closer to you.
the comment is triggered by the praise Honorable Minister gave to you about your student days when you were...
I somehow had this feeling we would come back to that, yeah. But you weren't there, you know, Rajiv.
No, I wasn't there, but, you know, historical evidence, which I've gathered. So, you were ace debater, you were a student activist, you were argumentative, and you were one of the toppers in history. Can I loosely call you a tigress during that phase?
Why do you put it in the past tense?
Okay, no,
I was a tigress and I remain a tigress, Royal Bengal tigress, right?
There's more to come. So then you sort of became the member of the Foreign Service, a very distinguished member of the Foreign Service.
You mean I became respectable, yes.
Then in conference halls, since you spent a lot of time in UN chambers, you would always have your way in negotiations. People say that was the Durga phase. Aggressive, getting your word in and making sure that word was accepted by the other side. Now, in this new phase, you have multiple rules. But one of the most satisfying rules, I suppose, is that of writing. So, will it be correct to say that would be the Saraswati phase?
I can't ever allow Rajiv to have the last word, right? So, Rajiv, I can't allow you to have the last word. So, I'm sorry, but in the Bengali pantheon, Durga and Saraswati sit together. Don't forget, you know, I said, no, that in my heart I'm a true Bengali. So if I am part Saraswati and part Durga, the most important that matters is I'm a Royal Bengal tigress. Okay? Thanks. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Bhaswati. All success for your book. And thank you so much for the wonderful, excellent assembly of some of the finest in Delhi. So all credit to you and to Honorable Minister. So thank you so much.
I think Director will give the vote. Yes.
Thank you, Ambassador Mukherjee and Ambassador Dogra, for that engaging conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please settle down. Ladies and gentlemen, request you to settle down. To conclude today's program, I would like to invite Mr. Sunit Tandon, Director, India Habitat Center, to propose a vote of thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, request you to settle down, please.
Honorable Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for attending this function. I have a very brief but very onerous duty to fulfill. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion, a matter of great satisfaction to all of us. First of all, I'd like to express my thanks to my teams in the Director's Office, the Program Section and the Banquet Section for all the hard work they put in to make this event possible. Many people were involved, but I cannot name them all. Nonetheless, I would like to make a special mention of Sandeep Kapoor, Sandeep Tandon, Rakesh Anand, Priyanka Manjari, Shadab, Naresh Vasib and Kanika for all your special contributions. Thanks are also due to my friend, Mr. Kapish Mehra, Managing Director, Rupa Publications India, and his team for not only having published the book, which has just been launched, but also for their collaboration, cooperation in organizing this event. Thank you so much. Much gratitude is due to Ambassador Rajiv Dogra for having so readily come on board to engage in this illuminating and, in fact, very, very engaging conversation about the book and the author. Warmest congratulations and thanks are due to the author herself, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, President of India Habitat Center, who has now added yet another feather in the cap of her many accomplishments with this book on a subject that has suffered unjustified neglect in the annals of our history. To our chief guest, the Honorable Minister, Shri Hardeep Singh Puri, goes our deepest gratitude for having made time, amidst his many onerous responsibilities, in his extremely busy schedule, to launch this book on its journey into the wider world. And my grateful thanks also to Mrs. Lakshmi Puri for having come for this event. Thank you very much, all of you, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this evening and sharing this happy occasion with the author, the publisher, with all of us. Thank you very much indeed.